The Sumerian text that reveals Earth. Before the Anunnaki arrived. In the vaults of the British Museum, catalogued among the vast collection of over 130,000 cuneiform tablets recovered from ancient Mesopotamian sites across modern Iraq and Syria, sits a document that describes something no human should have been able to witness firsthand. The text, known as the Enuma Elish, and inscribed sometime during the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE, but drawing on traditions that extend back centuries or even millennia before that, tells the story of creation not as a sudden divine act accomplished in days or through a single word of command, but as a process, a long, gradual, systematic transformation of Earth from a primordial, undifferentiated, chaotic state into an ordered world capable of supporting life, sustaining cities, and providing the foundation for human civilization. But what makes this text remarkable and sets it apart from creation narratives in other ancient traditions is not just that it describes the beginning of the world or that it presents a sophisticated cosmology. It is that the narrative is told from the perspective of beings who were supposedly present before humans existed, who observed Earth in its earliest state with their own eyes, and who took direct credit for transforming it step by step into the habitable planet we know today. The Sumerians called these beings the Anunnaki, and according to the tablets discovered and translated over the past century and a half, they did not create Earth from nothing in the manner described in biblical or other ancient Near Eastern creation accounts. They found it already existing in a raw, unformed state. The texts describe a world that existed before the Anunnaki's arrival and involvement, a planet in a primordial condition the Mesopotamians called the Abzu and Tiamat, the primordial fresh and salt waters of chaos from which everything eventually emerged through a process of divine engineering and systematic transformation. This pre-Anunnaki Earth was not empty. It was teeming with primordial forces that would later need to be conquered, inhabited by older beings who predated the organized pantheon of gods, and operating according to natural laws that would later be overthrown and replaced with the divinely decreed principles that governed the ordered cosmos. The tablets describe how the Anunnaki descended from heaven in what the texts treat as a historical event rather than a mythological metaphor, how they observed this chaotic world that predated their arrival, and how they systematically transformed it through sustained effort over what the texts suggest was an extended period of time, establishing order where there had been only formless potential, creating structure where there had been only undifferentiated substance, and imposing divine will where there had been only the random interactions of primordial forces. They tell of a time before cities existed anywhere on Earth, before agriculture had been invented or discovered, before humans had been created and given their role as workers and maintainers of civilization, when Earth was a fundamentally different place, a world ruled by forces the Anunnaki would have to defeat, suppress, or bind before they could establish their dominion and implement their plans for the planet's development. Tonight, we examine those texts with careful attention to what they actually claim rather than what we might prefer them to say, the world they describe in surprisingly specific and consistent detail across multiple sources separated by centuries, and the question that has puzzled mainstream scholars committed to naturalistic explanations, while fascinating alternative researchers open to more unconventional interpretations. If the Sumerian tablets are describing real events in mythological language, rather than pure fiction or symbolic allegory, what was Earth actually like before the arrival of the Anunnaki? This is the Sumerian text that reveals Earth before the Anunnaki arrived, the waters before creation. The most comprehensive Mesopotamian account of the primordial state is found in the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic written around 1800 BCE but drawing on much older Sumerian tradition. The text begins not with light or land or any recognizable feature of the world, but with water, two types of water that existed before anything else. The opening lines, which have been translated and analyzed by scholars for over a century, establish the cosmic scene. When on high the heaven had not been named, firm ground below had not been called by name, naught but primordial Apsu, their begetter, and Mumu Tiamat, she who bore them all, their waters commingling as a single body. This is a description of earth before differentiation, before the separation of land from sea occurred, before sky had been distinguished from ground, before fresh water flowing in rivers had been separated from salt water filling the ocean. The Apsu represented the subterranean freshwater ocean, the deep underground aquifers and springs from which wells and rivers drew their water, a concept grounded in observable reality, since Mesopotamia's cities depended on wells accessing underground water tables. In Mesopotamian cosmology, the Apsu was not just a physical place or geological feature, but a cosmic realm, a source of life-giving water and also of primordial creative power, a place where the boundaries between the divine and material realms were thin or non-existent. Tiamat, described as the salt waters, represented the sea vast, chaotic, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous to land-dwelling peoples who knew the destructive power of storm surges and floods. These two waters, mixing together without distinction or boundary, commingling in a state of undifferentiated unity, constituted the entirety of pre-creation earth, according to this ancient vision. The text makes clear that nothing else existed in this primordial state. There was no heaven that had been named, meaning the sky had not been separated from the waters below and given identity, purpose, or function. There was no firm ground that had been called by name, meaning dry land had not yet emerged from the waters, and been designated as distinct from the liquid chaos surrounding it. The world was formless, in the most literal sense, undifferentiated, with no boundaries between substances or realms, and unnamed, which in Mesopotamian thought meant it lacked true existence or identity. In Mesopotamian thought, heavily influenced by the power of written language and the authority of official records, to name something was to give it existence, identity, purpose, and function within the cosmic order. The unnamed world was a world without order, without purpose, without structure, without the me or divine principles that would later govern all aspects of reality. But the waters were not lifeless or inert, as one might imagine a purely physical ocean to be. The text describes Apsu and Tiamat not as inanimate substances or passive elements, but as primordial deities, sentient beings of immense power who represented and embodied the forces of chaos, who possessed consciousness and will, and who would eventually have to be confronted and defeated by the younger gods who emerged from their union. From their commingling, their mixing and interaction, their union in the primordial state, came the first generation of gods, the earliest divine beings who would begin the process of creating order from chaos. These were not the Anunnaki, who would come much later in the narrative, and represent a more organized, systematic pantheon. These were the primordial deities, beings born directly from chaos itself, who embodied the earliest stages of cosmic order beginning to emerge from formlessness, who represented the first differentiation and organization within the undifferentiated primal waters. The text names several of these primordial gods who emerged from the mixing of Apsu and Tiamat. Lachmu and Lahamu were the first pair to emerge, described as forms or shapes rising gradually from the mixing waters, solidifying from the liquid chaos. Their names suggest silt or mud, the first solid material to emerge as particles settled from the churning primordial ocean, representing the earliest stages of material differentiation from pure liquid. Next came Anshar and Kishar, whose names mean whole sky and whole earth respectively, representing the first conceptual division of the cosmos into upper and lower realms, though still mixed together physically rather than clearly separated as they would later be. From Anshar came Anu, the sky god who would become father of the Anunnaki and ruler of the heavens. And from Anu came Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, the god of wisdom and water, who would play a crucial role in later events, including the creation of humanity. This genealogy of gods, emerging from primordial waters, is not unique to Mesopotamia. Similar concepts appear in Egyptian creation myths where the god Atum emerged from the primordial waters of Nun, in Greek mythology where Oceanus and Tethys were primordial water deities who birthed the Titans, and in Hindu traditions where the cosmic ocean existed before creation. The universality of this image creation, beginning with water, order emerging from chaos, consciousness arising from formless substance, suggests either a common source for these traditions or a shared human intuition about the origins of existence. But the Mesopotamian version has specific details that distinguish it from other traditions. The Apsu and Tiamat are not described as benevolent life-giving sources, but as chaotic, potentially hostile forces. The text states that the younger gods, as they multiplied and became more active, began to disturb the primordial waters. Their movements, their noise, their very existence agitated Apsu and Tiamat, who had existed in quiescence before these new beings appeared. The disturbance was not welcome, it was an intrusion, a violation of the primordial peace. Apsu, disturbed by the noise and activity of the younger gods, decided to destroy them. The text records his words, "Their ways are verily loathsome unto me. By day I find no relief, nor repose by night. I will destroy, I will wreck their ways, that quiet may be restored. Let us have rest." This is not a moral judgment. Apsu does not accuse the younger gods of wickedness or violation of cosmic law. He simply wants to return to the peaceful, undisturbed state that existed before they emerged. The younger gods represent change, activity, order, and these qualities are incompatible with the formless chaos that Apsu embodies. But Ea, the wisest of the young gods, discovered the plot. He used magic to cast a spell of deep sleep over Apsu, rendering the primordial father powerless. Then, while Apsu slept, Ea killed him and established his own dwelling place in the Apsu, taking control of the subterranean waters and making them his domain. This was the first great act of cosmic violence, the first time the forces of order conquered the forces of chaos, and it established a pattern that would repeat throughout Mesopotamian creation mythology. With Apsu dead, Tiamat was initially passive, accepting the new order. But when Ea and the other young gods continued to make noise, continued to disturb the cosmic peace, Tiamat was persuaded by other primordial beings to avenge her consort. She created an army of monsters, serpents, dragons, and hybrid creatures, and prepared to wage war against the gods who had killed Apsu and stolen his waters. This set the stage for the central conflict of the Enuma Elish, the cosmic battle between Tiamat and Marduk. But more importantly, for understanding what Earth was like before the Anunnaki, it establishes that the primordial state was not empty or peaceful. It was inhabited by powerful, conscious forces that opposed the establishment of order, and that would need to be violently defeated before the organized cosmos could exist. The Earth described in these opening passages of the Enuma Elish is a planet covered entirely by water, with no land, no sky, no recognizable features. It is inhabited not by humans or even by the Anunnaki, but by primordial deities representing the raw, undifferentiated forces of nature itself. This is Earth before terraforming, before the cosmic ordering that would make it habitable, before the arrival of the beings who would claim dominion and establish the conditions necessary for civilization. It is a world of pure potential but also of chaos, a world that required violent conquest and systematic reorganization before it could become the earth described in later texts. The age before order. The period between the death of Apsu and the arrival of the Anunnaki on earth is described in fragmentary form across multiple texts, creating a picture of an intermediate age when the cosmos was partially ordered, but Earth itself remained largely chaotic and uninhabitable. This was the age when the first generation of gods existed, when cosmic laws were beginning to be established, but when the physical world remained in a state that would require extensive work to prepare for later habitation. The text known as the Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest Sumerian creation narratives, preserves details about this period that complement the Enuma Elish. While the Eridu Genesis tablet is badly damaged and large portions are missing, what survives describes a time when cities were not yet built and when earth was barren. The text states, "In those days the lands were not yet fertile, the grass did not yet grow, no tree had yet been planted, no brick had yet been laid, the cities had not yet been built." This description presents earth not as water-covered, as in the Enuma Elish, but as dry, barren, and lifeless. The apparent contradiction suggests either different traditions about the primordial state or different stages in Earth's transformation. If the Enuma Elish describes the earliest phase when water covered everything, the Eridu Genesis might describe a later stage after land had emerged but before vegetation or human habitation had been established. The transition from one state to the other would require explanation, and other texts provide that explanation through the actions of specific gods preparing Earth for future use. The god Enlil, whose name means Lord of the Air or Lord of the Storm, plays a central role in transforming the Earth from its primordial state. Multiple texts credit Enlil with separating heaven and earth, which had been mixed together or pressed against each other in the primordial state. One Sumerian hymn states, "Enlil, when you marked off holy settlements on earth, you built Nippur as your very own city. You gave it the pattern of heaven, the lofty crown. When you built the earth with the mold of the sky, you set up the bricks of heaven and earth in the city of Duranki." This passage describes an act of cosmic engineering, where Enlil physically separated the sky from the earth, creating space between them where air could exist and where life could eventually develop. The bricks of heaven and earth is not poetic language the Mesopotamians conceived of the cosmos as a physical structure that had been built according to specific plans. Heaven was solid, a dome of hammered metal or stone that kept the upper waters from flooding the earth. The earth was a disk floating on the lower waters of the Apsu. The space between them was where life existed, and Enlil was credited with creating and maintaining that space. Other texts describe how various gods shaped specific features of the earth during this preparatory period. Enki, now ruling the Apsu after killing the primordial father, organized the underground waters, establishing springs and rivers, controlling where water would flow and where it would be contained. The text known as Enki and the World Order describes this process in detail. Enki placed in charge of the whole heaven and earth the hero, the youth Enkimdu. He placed in charge of the Tigris and Euphrates Enbilulu. He placed in charge of the sea Sirara. He placed in charge of the rainstorms Ningirida. This systematic assignment of divine beings to manage specific aspects of the natural world indicates a transition from chaos to organization. The primordial waters were being divided, channeled, and controlled. The wild forces of nature were being assigned to specific deities who would manage them according to cosmic law. This was the establishment of what the Mesopotamians called the Mi, the divine principles or natural laws that governed how the cosmos operated. These me were not discovered but established, not natural but decreed, not eternal but instituted during this age of cosmic organization. But Earth itself, even as it was being organized by the gods, remained largely empty of life. Plants did not yet grow. They required soil, water, and sunlight to develop, and the texts suggest these conditions were still being established. Animals did not yet exist. They would be created later, once the environment could support them. And humans were not even conceived of. Yet the gods had not yet realized they needed workers to maintain the earth they were preparing. This empty, prepared, but not yet inhabited earth is described in texts as a kind of cosmic construction site. The gods were building, organizing, and establishing, but the project was incomplete. The planet had potential but no actualization, capability but no occupant. It was during this period, according to the texts, that a problem arose that would eventually lead to the need for human creation. The gods themselves were performing physical labor. The atrahasis, which focuses on this period, describes how the younger gods called the Igigi were assigned the task of digging irrigation channels, clearing fields, and doing the heavy work necessary to make Earth habitable and productive. The text states, "When the gods like men bore the work and suffered the toil of the gods was great, the work was heavy, the distress was much." This is a remarkable conception. Gods engaged in physical labor, suffering from exhaustion, experiencing the burden of work. In most religious traditions, gods are transcendent beings who speak reality into existence without effort. But in Mesopotamian tradition, even divine beings had to work with their hands, had to struggle with recalcitrant matter, had to spend years or centuries performing repetitive, exhausting tasks to achieve their goals. The implication is that even gods were subject to physical laws, that material reality had a stubborn existence independent of divine will, and that transforming Earth from chaos to order required not just commands, but sustained effort. The Igigi worked for 40 years, according to the Atrahasis, digging the channels that would become the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, clearing land that would become the first agricultural fields, preparing the infrastructure that would later support the first cities. But after 4 decades of hard labor, they rebelled. They burned their tools, marched on the house of Enlil, and demanded relief. The text preserves their complaint. "Every single one of us gods has declared war. We have put a stop to the digging. The load is excessive. It is killing us." This rebellion of the gods is one of the most significant events in Mesopotamian mythology because it led directly to the creation of humanity. Faced with a workforce strike by lesser deities who refused to continue the brutal labor, the great gods Anu, Enlil, and Enki convened a council to decide what to do. They could not simply destroy the Igigi because that would leave no one to do the necessary work. They could not do the work themselves because they were administrators, not laborers, and their roles required them to govern rather than dig ditches. The solution, proposed by Enki, was to create a new type of being, humans, who would take over the labor and free the gods from physical work. This is Earth immediately before human creation, a partially terraformed planet with rivers, fields, and basic infrastructure, but empty of the workforce needed to maintain and develop it. The gods had prepared Earth for habitation, but they had not yet created the inhabitants. The primordial chaos had been conquered, the cosmic structure had been established, but the planet itself was essentially a construction site, waiting for workers to arrive and begin the next phase of development. This vision of pre-Anunnaki and pre-human Earth, first covered in water, then barren, then partially terraformed but empty, is consistent across multiple texts and provides a narrative framework that is unusual in creation mythology. Most traditions describe creation as rapid, complete, and perfect from the beginning. The Mesopotamian tradition describes creation as a process, as incomplete and as requiring ongoing work to maintain. Earth was not a gift from the gods, but a project the gods were working on, and humans would eventually become the unpaid laborers who kept that project running. The descent from heaven. The actual arrival of the Anunnaki on Earth is described in multiple texts, but always indirectly, never as a singular event with a specific date. The term Anunnaki itself means those who from heaven to earth came, or offspring of Anu, referring to their descent from the sky god Anu, who ruled the heavens. The texts treat their presence on earth as the beginning of a new era, the moment when the transformation of the planet accelerated and took on the characteristics that would eventually make human civilization possible. The Sumerian king list provides one version of this arrival, stating, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridug." This single line encapsulates the concept that rulership, authority, and organized government were not human inventions, but divine gifts that came from above. The fact that kingship descended suggests a movement from a higher place to a lower place, from heaven to earth, from the realm of the gods to the physical world. The choice of Eridu as the first location is significant. Archaeological evidence confirms Eridu as one of the oldest settlements in Mesopotamia, with occupation layers extending back to around 5,400 BCE, making it genuinely ancient even by Mesopotamian standards. The phrase "descended from heaven" appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian texts describing the Anunnaki, but its exact meaning has been debated. Traditional scholarly interpretation reads it as metaphorical. The gods, dwelling in the celestial realm, chose to establish their presence on earth by building temples where they would receive worship and offerings. The descent was spiritual rather than physical, a decision to become involved in earthly affairs rather than remaining in distant transcendence. Alternative researchers, particularly those influenced by Zecharia Sitchin's interpretations, read the phrase more literally. They argue that descended from heaven means the Anunnaki arrived from space, traveling from another planet or celestial body, and landing on Earth in physical craft. They point to Sumerian cylinder seals depicting what they interpret as spacecraft, to tablets describing boats of heaven and celestial chambers, and to the Anunnaki's association with celestial bodies and astronomical knowledge, as evidence that these were extraterrestrial visitors rather than supernatural deities. Mainstream scholars largely reject this interpretation, noting that ancient peoples regularly described gods as dwelling in the sky or stars without implying extraterrestrial origin, that the boats of heaven more likely refer to the motion of celestial bodies across the sky, and that the evidence for ancient astronaut contact is speculative rather than conclusive. The debate continues, but what remains undisputed is that the Mesopotamians themselves believed the Anunnaki came from elsewhere, that they arrived on Earth at a specific point in the past, and that their arrival marked the beginning of organized civilization. The text known as the Descent of Inanna to the Underworld provides another model for understanding how the Mesopotamians conceived of travel between realms. Inanna, one of the Anunnaki, travels from heaven to the underworld and back again, passing through 7 gates, where she must remove pieces of her divine regalia. This suggests the Mesopotamians understood different realms as physically separated, requiring actual travel through intermediate spaces, and involving transformation or preparation to survive in different environments. If the gods could travel from heaven to the underworld and back, they could presumably travel from heaven to earth and back as well. Once the Anunnaki arrived on Earth, the texts describe them as immediately beginning to establish order, assign roles, and organize the planet according to divine principles. The text Enki and the World Order provides the most comprehensive account of this organizational phase. Enki, the Lord of Fates, the King of Eridu, entrusted the divine plans to the great gods, and to the lesser gods he gave the supervision. He set up the places of the gods, established the holy places. He stationed the Anunnaki gods, assigned them their divine duties. This passage describes a hierarchical system being imposed on earth. The great gods, Anu, Enlil, Enki, and a few others, received the high-level plans, the overall design for how earth should be organized. The lesser gods, the Igigi, and minor deities were assigned supervisory roles, managing specific aspects of the natural world. And the Anunnaki collectively were stationed in specific locations, given temples and cities from which they would govern their assigned territories. The geography of this divine settlement is described in various texts. Eridu in the south was assigned to Enki, who would manage the Apsu and the fresh waters. Nippur in the center was assigned to Enlil, who would govern the air and storms. Uruk was assigned to Anu and his daughter Inanna, who would oversee heaven and warfare. Each major city had a patron deity from the Anunnaki, and the cities themselves were understood as earthly residences, where these gods physically dwelled, ate offerings brought by humans, and managed their assigned domains. The texts describe the Anunnaki as numbering 50 great gods who formed the divine council, along with hundreds or perhaps thousands of lesser divine beings, who served as workers, messengers, and assistants. This creates an image not of remote, transcendent deities, but of an occupying force, a management team sent to oversee the transformation of a planet that was being prepared for some larger purpose. What was that purpose? The texts suggest Earth was being made habitable not primarily for humans, who did not yet exist, but for the gods themselves. The Anunnaki wanted temples, cities, offerings, worship, none of which could exist on a chaotic, barren world. They needed Earth to be productive, organized, and populated by workers who could maintain the infrastructure and provide the services the gods required. This utilitarian view of creation Earth as a project, humans as workers, is distinctly Mesopotamian and contrasts sharply with creation narratives in other traditions where Earth is made as a gift to humanity, or where humans are the pinnacle and purpose of creation. The texts also hint at conflict or tension between different groups of gods regarding Earth's use and governance. The division between the Anunnaki, those who came to Earth, and the Igigi, those who remained in heaven or performed the initial labor, appears repeatedly, suggesting not all divine beings had the same relationship to or authority over the planet. The Igigi's rebellion, described in the Atrahasis, indicates that some gods resented the work required to transform Earth and were willing to challenge the authority of their superiors. This created political tensions in heaven that would eventually affect Earth's development. The arrival and settlement of the Anunnaki on Earth, then, was not a gentle gift of divine presence, but a colonial enterprise, beings from elsewhere taking control of a territory, reorganizing it according to their preferences, establishing a hierarchy of management, and eventually creating a labor force to maintain the system they had imposed. Whether this occurred through physical arrival from space, spiritual descent from heaven, or some other mode the texts do not clearly specify, the Mesopotamian tradition is consistent that Earth was fundamentally changed by the Anunnaki's arrival, that the planet before they came was different from the planet after they established their dominion, and that human civilization itself emerged from this transformation, the terraforming of the Earth. If the Sumerian texts are describing something akin to what we might call terraforming, the systematic modification of a planet to make it suitable for habitation, then the most detailed account of this process appears in various texts describing the specific actions taken by individual gods to shape Earth's environment. These actions are not described as instant miracles, but as sustained projects requiring planning, effort, and time to complete. The creation or organization of Earth's water system is attributed primarily to Enki, whose domain was specifically the waters. The text Enki and the World Order describes this in detail. Father Enki purified the Euphrates with his fresh waters. He filled it with fishes of the depths. He established canebrakes in its marshes. Enbilulu, the inspector of canals, he placed in charge of the Euphrates and the Tigris. This is not creation ex nihilo. The text does not say Enki created water or rivers from nothing. Instead, it says he purified, filled, established, and organized what was already there, suggesting a process of modification and control rather than original creation. The same pattern appears in descriptions of other environmental modifications. Enlil organized the atmosphere and weather. Enlil brought forth the seed from the earth. He hurried to separate heaven from earth. He hurried to separate earth from heaven. To make the name of mankind sprout, he set his mind. The separation of heaven and earth appears in multiple texts and seems to describe the establishment of a stable atmosphere, possibly the fixing of Earth's relationship to the sun and seasons, creating conditions where life could survive. The goddess Ninhursag, also called Nintu or Ninmah, is credited with organizing plant and animal life. Various texts describe her establishing the patterns of vegetation, determining which plants would grow in which climates, and organizing animals according to their habitats. One text states, Ninhursag gave birth to cattle, Ninhursag gave birth to sheep. She brought forth the pleasant plants, she made gardens grow green. This biological organization determining what would live where and under what conditions is described as deliberate divine action rather than natural evolution. The establishment of metals and mining is attributed to various gods, but especially to those associated with underground realms. The text describes how the gods caused copper and tin to come forth from the mountains, how they established silver and gold in their proper places, and how they made lapis lazuli appear. These statements have been interpreted both as mythological explanations for where minerals come from and as possible descriptions of mining operations or resource surveys conducted by the Anunnaki. The creation of agricultural systems is described in multiple texts as a key divine project. The god Ashnan was made responsible for grain, the goddess Laha for cattle, and Enlil himself for the plough and cultivation. The text Enlil and the pickaxe describes how Enlil fastened the earth fastening pins, set up the brick mould, made the plough and yoke appear, and caused the seed to come up from the earth. These descriptions suggest systematic preparation of earth for agriculture, establishing the conditions necessary for crops to grow and for permanent settlements to be sustained. The establishment of seasons and calendar is credited to the sun god Utu, Shamash in Akkadian, and the moon god Nana. Various texts describe how they made the days complete, established the months, organized the year into seasons, and separated day from night. The precision with which the Mesopotamians observed celestial movements and maintained accurate calendars suggests they attached great importance to this divine ordering of time, seeing it as fundamental to the organization of earthly affairs. The cumulative effect of these descriptions is a picture of systematic environmental engineering. Each god had a specific responsibility. Each aspect of the natural world was deliberately organized, and the entire process followed a plan that had been established before execution began. The texts describe meetings where the gods discussed what needed to be done, councils where tasks were assigned, and reports where completed work was reviewed. This bureaucratic approach to creation is distinctly Mesopotamian and suggests the authors conceived of the gods as functioning like a government administration rather than as mysterious, supernatural forces. The question archaeologists and historians struggle with is how literally to interpret these descriptions. If purely mythological, They represent ancient attempts to explain natural phenomena by attributing them to divine actions. Rivers exist because Enki organized them. Plants grow because Ninhursag established them. Seasons change because Utu and Nana regulate them. This is theology as proto-science, using the only explanatory framework available to pre-scientific peoples. But some researchers note that the descriptions are unusually specific and technical for pure mythology. The texts describe processes, sequences, and consequences, rather than just attributing final states to divine will. They explain not just that rivers exist, but how they were purified, directed, and stocked with fish. They describe not just that agriculture exists, but how tools were created, soil was prepared, and seeds were distributed. This level of procedural detail is more characteristic of technical manuals or historical accounts than of mythological explanations. Alternative researchers argue these texts might preserve memory of actual large-scale environmental modifications conducted by an advanced civilization, whether the Anunnaki as extraterrestrials, a lost human civilization, or the Mesopotamians' own early ancestors, whose achievements have been mythologized. They point to evidence of sophisticated ancient irrigation systems, massive earthworks that diverted rivers, and agricultural techniques that seem to appear fully developed rather than showing gradual evolution. If an advanced group did systematically terraform parts of Mesopotamia, making it suitable for the first cities, survivors might remember this as divine action and record it in mythological language. The mainstream scholarly consensus remains that these texts are mythological explanations for natural phenomena, but there is growing recognition that the line between myth and history in ancient texts is not always clear. The Mesopotamians themselves treated these accounts as historical, as records of actual events performed by real divine beings who had physically inhabited Earth. Whether modern scholars agree with that assessment depends largely on how they interpret the nature of the Anunnaki as mythological constructs, as metaphors for natural forces, as cultural memories of human accomplishments, or as something else entirely. What remains indisputable is that the texts describe Earth before the Anunnaki as chaotic and inhospitable, and Earth after their work as organized and habitable. The transition from one state to the other is attributed to deliberate, sustained divine action that transformed the planet's environment. Whether this was myth explaining nature or history describing intervention, it provided the Mesopotamians with an origin story that was fundamentally different from most creation narratives, a story not of instant divine creation, but of gradual divine engineering. The problem of labor. The transformation of Earth from chaos to order, from barren to habitable, from empty to productive, all of this required work. The Mesopotamian texts are remarkably consistent on this point. Even gods had to labor, and the labor was hard, exhausting, and eventually intolerable. This emphasis on divine toil is unusual in religious literature, which typically presents gods as effortlessly omnipotent, but it is central to understanding the Mesopotamian worldview, and specifically to understanding why humans were created. The Atrahasis, the most detailed account of this period, describes how the Igigi younger gods, assigned to physical labor, were commanded to dig the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The text states, "They dug the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. They opened them so that they held water. They cleaned the smaller rivers and established cities." This was massive engineering work, moving millions of tons of earth to create channels deep and wide enough to carry major rivers, establishing water sources for the cities that would eventually be built along their banks. The work lasted 40 years according to the text, during which time the Igigi bore the work and suffered the toil. The language emphasizes the physical burden, the repetitive exhaustion, the relentless demands of the labor. The gods day and night dug the earth, moved stones, shaped channels, and maintained the works they had created. There was no rest, no relief, no recognition of their suffering from the senior gods who had assigned the work. This situation eventually became intolerable. The text describes the breaking point. When the gods like men bore the work and suffered the toil of the gods was great, the work was heavy, the distress was much. The Anunnaki made the Igigi suffer the work. For 40 years they bore the excessive burden. Night and day they groaned. They were complaining, backbiting, grumbling in the excavation. Let us confront our Chamberlain and make him free us from our heavy work. The decision to rebel was deliberate and organized. The Igigi did not simply stop working, they burned their tools, destroyed the equipment they had been using, and marched in formation to confront Enlil, the god who had assigned them the labor. The text preserves their complaint. Every single one of us gods has declared war. We have put a stop to the digging. The load is excessive, it is killing us. Our work is too hard, the trouble too much. This is extraordinary language. Gods, supposedly immortal and powerful, claiming that physical work is killing them, that the load is excessive, that they are suffering genuine distress. The implication is that even divine beings have physical limitations, that they experience fatigue and pain, and that they can be pushed beyond their capacity to endure. This contradicts the omnipotence typically attributed to gods in most religious traditions, but creates a more realistic, more relatable portrayal of divine beings, who are powerful but not unlimited. Enlil's initial response was rage. He wanted to punish the rebels, to destroy them for their insubordinance and disobedience. But Anu, the father of the gods, intervened with a practical question. What are we accusing them of? Their work was heavy, their distress was much. Every day they groaned. The complaint is legitimate. What are we to do about it? This acknowledgement that the gods' complaint was legitimate is significant. It means even the senior Anunnaki recognized that the labor system they had imposed was unsustainable. They could not simply force the Igigi to continue working, both because the work was genuinely too burdensome and because the Igigi had organized and could fight back if pushed too far. The Divine Council was facing a labor crisis that threatened the entire terraforming project. Earth was half prepared, critical infrastructure was incomplete, but the workforce had gone on strike and showed no signs of returning to work under the current conditions. The solution proposed by Enki was revolutionary: create a new type of being to take over the labor. This being would be made from clay earth itself, the very substance the Igigi had been digging and shaping. It would be animated with divine essence, the blood of a slain god mixed into the clay to give it life and consciousness, but it would be mortal, limited, and specifically designed for labor. It would not have the power to rebel effectively, would not live long enough to become organized or experienced, and would reproduce naturally without requiring constant divine intervention to maintain population levels. The text describes this proposal and its acceptance. Let them slaughter one god, and let the gods be purified by immersion. With his flesh and blood, let Nintu mix clay, that God and man may be thoroughly mixed in the clay, that we may hear the drumbeat forever after. Let there be a spirit from the god's flesh. Let it proclaim living man as its sign, so that this not be forgotten. Let there be a spirit. The god chosen for slaughter was We'ila, also called Geshtue in some versions, described as having intelligence or understanding. His death and the mixing of his blood with clay created humanity beings, with divine consciousness inherited from Ila's blood, but with earthly limitations inherited from the clay. Humans were hybrids, mixtures of divine and earthly nature, capable of understanding divine commands, but limited in power and lifespan. 7 male and 7 female humans were created in this initial batch, shaped by the goddess Nintu, also called Ninhursag or Belet Ili, who molded the clay mixtures and gave them form. The text describes the process in procedural detail. Nintu nipped off 14 pieces of clay. 7 she deposited on the right, 7 she deposited on the left. Between them she placed the brick. She made use of the midwife's body. She called the wise wives to be in attendance. 7 and 7, the birth goddesses assembled. 7 produced males, 7 produced females. The mother goddess opened the womb. Man came forth from the womb. This description of human creation as a deliberate manufacturing process, conducted by divine craftspeople following a specific procedure, is remarkably different from the biblical account where God forms Adam from dust and breathes life into him. The Mesopotamian version is industrial, collective, and explicitly designed to solve a labor problem. Humans were not created to commune with God, to serve as the pinnacle of creation, or to rule over earth. They were created to work so that the gods would not have to maintain the terraformed environment, so that divine beings could enjoy the fruits of that environment without the burdens of maintaining it. The creation of humanity solved the Anunnaki's labor problem and allowed the terraforming of Earth to continue. The Igigi were freed from physical work and assigned to supervisory roles. The great gods could now focus on governance and management rather than implementation. And Earth, which had required divine labor to transform from chaos to order, would henceforth be maintained by mortal workers who would never threaten divine supremacy because they were designed from the beginning to be subordinate. This view of human origins as an engineered solution to a workforce shortage challenges theological assumptions in ways the Mesopotamians themselves may not have fully recognized. It suggests humans were not the purpose of creation, but an afterthought, not the image of God, but a hybrid created from divine blood and earthly clay, specifically to serve as laborers. It implies that Earth's transformation was not undertaken for humanity's benefit, but for the benefit of the gods, and that humans inherited a planet that had been shaped for divine purposes and would always, in some sense, belong to those who had first claimed and modified it, the cities that rose from chaos. Once humanity had been created to serve as the workforce, the transformation of Earth accelerated dramatically. The texts describe a period of intense urban development when the first cities were established, when the Anunnaki built their temples and residences, and when the systems of agriculture, irrigation, and governance were finalized. This was Earth's transition from construction site to functional civilization, from potential to actuality. The Eridu Genesis, despite its fragmentary state, preserves crucial details about this urban phase. After the assembly of the gods established kingship, after the august tiara of kingship descended from heaven, the holy settlement was complete, the holy cities were fair. Their names were pronounced and portions distributed. This passage indicates that the establishment of cities was not random but planned, that each city was assigned to a specific god, and that the entire urban system was laid out before construction began. The text continues with a list. Holy Eridu was given to Nudimud, Bad Tibira was given to the Lady of Light, Larak was given to Pabilsag, Sippar was given to the hero Utu, Shurapak was given to Sud. Each city received not just a patron deity, but a specific role within the larger network. Eridu, as the first city and home of Enki, was the center of wisdom and water management. Sippar, home of the sun god Utu, became the center of divination and timekeeping. Nippur, though not listed in this particular fragment, was established as the religious capital where the assembly of the gods convened. The construction of these cities is described in terms suggesting massive coordinated effort. Temples rose to dominate each urban center, designed as residences for the gods and as administrative centers for managing the surrounding territories. The ziggurat-form stepped pyramid structures topped with temples emerged during this period, creating artificial mountains where gods could dwell elevated above the human populace. These were not places of worship in the modern sense, but actual houses where gods supposedly lived, ate offerings brought by priests, and conducted the business of governance. The text Hymn to Enlil describes the scale and grandeur of the temple at Nippur. Enlil's house, Ekor, mountain house, pure place that is inside. House of the great gods, shrine where the fates are decreed. House whose design is great, whose structure is strong, whose interior is dark like the sky. House whose shade stretches over all lands, mountain rising high and reaching the heavens. This description emphasizes both the physical impressiveness of the structure and its cosmic significance. The temple was not just a building, but a nexus point connecting heaven and earth, a place where divine and human realms intersected. The establishment of these cities required not just construction, but also the organization of human labor on unprecedented scales. Thousands of workers had to be fed, housed, and directed. Agricultural systems had to be developed to produce surplus food. Irrigation networks had to be constructed and maintained. Defensive walls had to be built to protect against flooding and potential enemies. The texts describe all of this as directed by the gods, but implemented by humans following divine instructions. The tablets also describe the establishment of specialized professions and social hierarchies. The Eridu Genesis states, "They named the shepherd's crook and the farmer's crook. They established pastures and set up sheepfolds. He granted prosperity to the lands." This division of labor, shepherds and farmers, each with their specific roles, marked the transition from simple subsistence to complex society. Craftsmen emerged who specialized in metallurgy, pottery, weaving, and other trades. Scribes were trained to keep records. Priests were appointed to mediate between gods and humans. Kings were installed to govern in the gods' names. This social organization is consistently attributed to divine design rather than human invention. The texts present civilization not as human achievement, but as a system designed by the Anunnaki and implemented through human labor. Humans did not domesticate animals. The gods assigned Lahar to manage cattle and established pastoral life. Humans did not develop agriculture. The gods, particularly Enlil and Ashnan, established the principles of cultivation and taught humans to follow them. Humans did not create writing. The god Nabu, or Enki in earlier traditions, invented the script and gave it to selected humans who became the first scribes. This attribution of every significant advancement to divine instruction or gift creates a picture of humans as recipients and executors rather than inventors or creators. Earth before humans was chaos being transformed by gods. Earth with humans was an ordered system maintained by workers following divine blueprints. The cities that rose were not human achievements. They were divine projects implemented through human hands. Archaeological evidence provides a more complex picture. The development of Mesopotamian civilization can be traced through successive phases: Ubaid, Uruk, early dynastic, each showing gradual elaboration of technology, social organization, and urban planning. There is clear evidence of experimentation, of trial and error, of innovations being tested and refined over generations. This suggests indigenous development rather than sudden introduction of fully formed knowledge. However, some aspects of Mesopotamian civilization appear surprisingly sophisticated from their earliest appearance. Writing, when it first appears around 3400 BCE, is already capable of expressing complex administrative and abstract concepts. The base 60 mathematical system is present from the beginning and shows no evidence of prior, simpler systems. Astronomical observations recorded in the earliest texts show knowledge of planetary cycles that should have required centuries of systematic observation to discover. These precocious developments have led some researchers to argue that Mesopotamian civilization inherited knowledge from earlier sources, whether from the gods as the texts claim, from a lost earlier civilization, or from systematic observation and accumulation of knowledge, before writing existed, to record the process. The texts themselves preserve traditions suggesting knowledge was inherited rather than discovered. References to ancient tablets and wisdom from before the flood appear repeatedly. Kings boast of restoring temples according to ancient plans and of discovering and preserving old knowledge. The conservative nature of Mesopotamian education, where students spent years copying ancient texts rather than creating new ones, suggests a culture that saw itself as preserving and transmitting inherited wisdom rather than generating new knowledge. Whether this inherited wisdom came from the Anunnaki as the texts claim, or whether the Anunnaki themselves were later mythological attribution for human achievements, the Mesopotamian texts present a consistent picture. Earth before the cities was chaos, or barren land. Earth with the cities was ordered, productive, and governed according to divine principles. The transformation from one state to the other was attributed to the arrival and work of beings from heaven who systematically modified the planet, created humanity to maintain it, and established the urban civilization that would characterize Mesopotamian culture for 3 millennia. The cosmic order established. The final phase of Earth's transformation from chaos to order involved not just physical terraforming or urban construction, but the establishment of what the Mesopotamians called the Me, divine principles or cosmic laws that governed how everything operated. The Me were not discovered, but decreed, not natural, but instituted, and their establishment marked the completion of the Anunnaki's transformation of Earth from an undifferentiated primordial state to an ordered cosmos operating according to fixed principles. The concept of the Me is central to Mesopotamian thought, but difficult to translate precisely into modern terms. The word encompasses law, principle, divine decree, natural order, and social custom all at once. The Me governed both physical phenomena, how rivers flow, how the sun moves, how plants grow, and social phenomena, how kings rule, how priests conduct rituals, how justice is administered. They were the operating system of reality itself, the code that determined what happened and how. The text Inanna and the Me provides the most detailed catalogue of what the Me included. The narrative describes how the goddess Inanna travelled to Enki's temple in Eridu, and through cleverness and beer, convinced him to give her over 100 Me to bring to her city of Uruk. The list is extensive and reveals the scope of what the Mesopotamians considered ordained by divine decree: kingship, godship, the tiara of office, the throne of kingship, the scepter, the staff, the measuring rod and line, the priestly office, lordship, divinity, the great crown, the crown of the king, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the art of lovemaking, the kissing of the phallus, prostitution, law, slander, music, eldership, heroism, power, enmity, straightforwardness, the destruction of cities, lamentation, the cult, the shrine, the tambourine and drum, the shrine, the sacred altar. The list continues, with dozens more Me covering everything from crafts to warfare, to emotional states, to social roles. What unites them is that all are understood as instituted, as part of the divine order established when the Anunnaki organized Earth. None are natural in the modern sense of existing independently of conscious design. All are Me, divine principles that were established at a specific time, and that could theoretically be altered if the gods chose to do so. The establishment of the Me is described as occurring after the physical transformation of Earth was largely complete but before human civilization was fully functional. The gods gathered in council and formally decreed the operating principles for the world they had created. Anu, as the highest authority, confirmed each me, giving it cosmic force. Enlil, as king of earth, implemented each me, ensuring it was followed. Enki, as the keeper of wisdom, recorded each me on tablets kept in the Abzu, creating an archive of the cosmic order that could be consulted when disputes arose. This formal establishment of cosmic law through divine decree is parallel to how kings established law codes. Hammurabi's famous law code, carved on a massive stone stele, was presented as divinely inspired. Shamash, the sun god and god of justice, gave Hammurabi the laws, and the king simply recorded and enforced them. Similarly, the me were presented as decrees issued by the divine assembly and written down so they could not be forgotten or disputed. The me were not immutable, however. The story of Inanna stealing them from Enki shows they could be transferred between gods. Wars between gods are sometimes described as fights over the me, with victorious deities claiming the me previously held by the defeated. The rise of Marduk to supremacy in Babylon involved his accumulation of me from older gods, making him more powerful by possessing more of the divine principles that governed reality. This understanding of cosmic order as decreed rather than inherent is distinctly Mesopotamian. In Greek philosophy, natural law, physis, was understood as existing independently, discovered through reason rather than revealed by gods. In biblical thought, God's law is an expression of his unchanging nature. But in Mesopotamian thought, even the gods were subject to the me they had collectively established, and cosmic order was the result of decisions made by divine beings rather than emanations of transcendent truth. The establishment of the me completed the transformation of Earth from its pre-Anunnaki state. The planet had been organized physically: land separated from water, rivers channeled, climate regulated. It had been populated, humans created, animals distributed, plants established. It had been urbanized, cities built, temples raised, social hierarchies instituted. And now it had been given its operating principles, the laws that governed both nature and society, ensuring everything functioned according to the divine plan. This multi-phase transformation from water-covered chaos to barren land to partially terraformed world to inhabited planet to fully ordered cosmos is the narrative arc the Mesopotamian texts present for Earth's development. At each stage, the Anunnaki are credited with directing the process, making decisions, doing work, and establishing principles. The texts treat all of this as historical, as events that actually occurred in the past, and that explain why the world is as it is. Whether modern readers accept this account as historical, mythological, or something in between, it provides remarkable insight into how the Mesopotamians understood their relationship to their environment, their gods, and the deep past that preceded their civilization. The alternative readings. The question of how to interpret the Mesopotamian texts describing pre-Anunnaki Earth and the transformation that followed has divided researchers for over a century. Mainstream scholarship treats these texts as mythology-creative attempts by ancient peoples to explain natural phenomena, legitimize social hierarchies, and provide cosmic meaning to human existence. Alternative researchers argue the texts preserve genuine historical memory of actual events, whether involving extraterrestrials, a lost advanced human civilization, or misunderstood natural phenomena that left profound cultural impressions. The mainstream interpretation rests on several foundations. First, the texts contain elements that are clearly mythological, primordial deities born from chaos, gods who eat and sleep and experience emotions like humans, cosmic battles that remake the universe. These elements are common to mythology worldwide, and serve psychological and social functions rather than historical documentation. Second, the scientific understanding of Earth's formation through natural processes over billions of years contradicts the timeline suggested by the texts, which compress cosmic and planetary history into at most a few thousand years. Third, there is no archaeological or geological evidence for a sudden, planned transformation of Earth as described in the texts. The development of life, the formation of continents and oceans, and the establishment of climate systems are all explicable through natural processes without requiring divine intervention. From this perspective, the texts are valuable not as historical accounts, but as windows into Mesopotamian religious thought, social organization, and cultural values. The emphasis on divine labor reflects a society where hard work was necessary for survival. The creation of humanity to serve as a workforce reflects actual social hierarchies where common people labored to support elite classes. The establishment of the me as divine decrees reflects how kings legitimize their laws by claiming divine origin. The texts tell us about Mesopotamian culture, but they tell us nothing reliable about Earth's actual prehistoric past. Alternative interpretations challenge several assumptions underlying the mainstream view. They argue that ancient peoples, despite lacking modern scientific frameworks, were careful observers who recorded what they saw and knew, even if they used mythological language to describe it. They point to elements in the texts that seem oddly specific for pure invention: the detailed descriptions of terraforming activities, the systematic organization of divine roles, the procedural accounts of human creation. They ask why the Mesopotamians, if simply inventing stories, would describe gods engaged in physical labor, experiencing failure and frustration, and requiring solutions to problems rather than simply speaking reality into perfect existence. Zecharia Sitchin's interpretation, perhaps the most famous alternative reading, argues that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrials from a planet called Nibiru, who came to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago to mine gold. The terraforming described in the texts was literal planetary engineering, establishing mining operations, developing food production systems, and eventually genetically engineering humans, Homo sapiens, from existing hominids to create a worker species. Sitchin translated key Sumerian terms differently from mainstream scholars, reading Dingir as those who from heaven came rather than simply gods, and interpreting heavenly boats as spacecraft rather than celestial bodies. Mainstream Assyriologists have thoroughly debunked Sitchin's translations, pointing out numerous errors in his reading of cuneiform, misunderstandings of Sumerian grammar, and unsupported interpretations of ambiguous terms. His proposed planet Nibiru, with its 3,600-year orbit, violates known orbital mechanics and has never been observed, despite extensive astronomical surveys. His timeline placing the Anunnaki's arrival, 450,000 years ago, contradicts both the archaeological record of Mesopotamian civilization, which dates to roughly 3,500 BCE, and the biological evidence for human evolution. Yet Sitchin's work has remained popular because it offers a provocative alternative to both mainstream archaeology and religious orthodoxy, suggesting humanity has a far older and stranger history than conventional accounts allow. A different alternative interpretation suggests the texts preserve cultural memory of a lost human civilization, perhaps one existing before the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 BCE, that possessed advanced knowledge, subsequently lost and only partially recovered. Researchers like Graham Hancock have argued that a sophisticated maritime civilization existed during the Ice Age, was devastated by rapid climate change and catastrophic flooding as glaciers melted, and survived only through scattered remnants whose knowledge was mythologized by later cultures. In this reading, the Anunnaki were survivors of this earlier civilization who arrived in Mesopotamia with advanced knowledge, taught local populations, and were later deified by their descendants. This interpretation has the advantage of not requiring extraterrestrials or divine intervention, but it faces significant challenges. No unambiguous archaeological evidence for a global advanced civilization predating known civilizations has been found, though proponents argue rising sea levels submerged coastal sites where such evidence might exist. The genetic and linguistic evidence for human migration and cultural development does not support a single source civilization spreading knowledge worldwide. And the specific claims about advanced lost technologies are not borne out by the material record. If such technologies existed, some artifacts should remain. A third alternative interpretation focuses on natural catastrophes as the basis for the mythological accounts. The descriptions of Earth covered in water, of catastrophic changes separating pre-flood from post-flood worlds, and of massive environmental modification could preserve cultural memory of real disasters, the flooding of the Black Sea, the inundation of the Persian Gulf Basin, or regional catastrophes in Mesopotamia itself. The terraforming would then be exaggerated accounts of actual land reclamation, irrigation projects, and agricultural development undertaken by early Mesopotamians, whose accomplishments were later mythologized and attributed to gods. This naturalistic alternative has more support from archaeology and geology, as there is clear evidence for catastrophic flooding events in the ancient Near East, and for sophisticated water management systems developed by early Mesopotamian cultures. However, it still requires explaining why such events would be described in terms of divine beings arriving from heaven, why the transformation would be portrayed as planned and coordinated rather than as human response to natural challenges, and why the texts consistently credit external divine intervention rather than human ingenuity. Each interpretation faces challenges and leaves questions unresolved. The mainstream view explains the mythological elements, but struggles with the technical details and unusual specificity of some descriptions. The extraterrestrial hypothesis explains the technological elements, but lacks physical evidence, and requires accepting claims about ancient astronauts that cannot be verified. The lost civilization theory explains the advanced knowledge, but lacks archaeological confirmation, and requires explaining why such a civilization left so little trace. The naturalistic catastrophe theory explains the environmental descriptions but requires extensive reinterpretation of the text's plain meaning. What remains clear is that the Mesopotamian texts themselves present a consistent picture. Earth existed in a chaotic, inhospitable state before the Anunnaki arrived and was systematically transformed through their actions into the ordered, habitable world where human civilization developed. Whether this account preserves distorted historical memory, mythologizes natural events, or is pure creative fiction created to serve religious and social functions, it shaped how the Mesopotamians understood their world and their place in cosmic history. The memory that endures. Over 4,000 years after these texts were first written, and over 2,000 years after the last cuneiform tablet was inscribed, the Mesopotamian accounts of Earth's transformation continue to generate debate, speculation, and wonder. The tablets remain, the words can be read, the claims are clear, but their meaning remains elusive, suspended between history and mythology, between literal and symbolic, between testimony and imagination. What the texts describe is fundamentally unsettling to modern assumptions about history and human development. They present civilization not as a gradual human achievement, but as a project implemented by others, not as indigenous development, but as external intervention, not as natural evolution, but as deliberate design. They locate human origin not in God's image or evolutionary process, but in the practical decision of beings who needed workers, and created a species to fill that need. They portray Earth not as a gift provided for humanity, but as a project undertaken for other purposes, with humans as late additions to an environment shaped by and for the benefit of others. Whether any of this is literally true, whether beings from elsewhere really did arrive on Earth, transform its environment, and create humans may be less important than recognizing how the Mesopotamians themselves understood these claims. They treated this as their history, as the explanation for where they came from and why their world was as it was. They preserved these accounts with the same care they used for legal documents and administrative records. They transmitted them across centuries and miles with remarkable consistency. They built their entire civilization on the foundation of these origin stories, establishing temples to honor the Anunnaki, organizing society according to the hierarchies described in the texts, and accepting their role as servants of divine beings who had shaped the world before humans existed. The modern response to these texts reflects contemporary concerns more than ancient realities. Those seeking alternatives to religious orthodoxy find in them evidence that traditional creation accounts are incomplete or mistaken. Those interested in ancient astronaut theories find in them descriptions that seem to match technological civilization rather than primitive mythology. Those committed to mainstream archaeology find in them interesting examples of mythological thought, but nothing that challenges scientific understanding of Earth's history or human origins. But perhaps the texts deserve to be read on their own terms, as ancient voices attempting to preserve what they believe to be true, even if we cannot fully determine what truth they were preserving. The Mesopotamians described Earth before the Anunnaki as chaotic, water-covered, and inhospitable. They described the Anunnaki's arrival as a turning point, the beginning of order and organization. They described a systematic transformation of the planet through directed labor, divine planning, and the establishment of principles that would govern how everything functioned. And they described humans as created specifically to maintain the system established by others, to work the earth that had been prepared for divine purposes, to serve needs they did not define and could not escape. This vision of human origins and Earth's transformation challenges the narratives we prefer to tell ourselves, stories of human agency, of our special status in creation, of our destiny to rule and reshape the world according to our purposes. The Mesopotamian texts suggest we inherited a world already shaped by others, that our civilization was built on foundations we did not lay, and that our role was assigned rather than chosen. Whether the Anunnaki were gods, extraterrestrials, advanced humans from an earlier age, or mythological constructs created to explain mysteries the Mesopotamians could not otherwise understand, the texts present a humbling vision of humanity as inheritors rather than originators, as servants rather than masters, as late arrivals to a world already ancient when we appeared. The tablets remain, fired clay preserving words that have survived floods, wars, and empires. They can still be read, though their meaning grows no clearer with time. They describe a world before our kind existed, beings who shaped the environment we inhabit, and a transformation so complete that we can barely imagine what preceded it. Whether we read them as history or mythology, as testimony or fiction, they stand as ancient testimony to a vision of Earth's past that was radically different from the present, a time before cities, before agriculture, before humanity, when the Anunnaki walked a world of chaos and systematically transformed it into the ordered cosmos their texts describe. The question of what Earth was like before the Anunnaki arrived may never be answered to everyone's satisfaction. The tablets that claim to describe that era are too ancient, too embedded in cultural contexts, we can only partially reconstruct, too open to multiple interpretations, and too fantastic in their claims to serve as reliable historical documents in the modern sense. But they endure, these clay records of ancient beliefs, and they continue to pose questions about origins, about the relationship between humanity and those who came before, and about whether the world we inhabit was given to us or was always intended for others, with us as temporary custodians of an inheritance we did not earn and do not fully understand. The Sumerians believed they knew what Earth was like before the Anunnaki, and they wrote it down so we would not forget. Whether we believe them is less important than recognizing that they believed it themselves, and that belief shaped one of humanity's first and most influential civilizations.